Enarche ein ho logos, kai ho logos and proston theon. I was sitting in Father Gignac's class called Introduction to New Testament Greek. Father Gignac was a legend at Catholic University, and there I sat in that classroom. He read this Greek text to us midway through the semester, and then he said, "Who can translate?" Since we all remained silent for a moment, he just pointed and said, "Michael, you translate." I couldn't do it. Then he pointed to Rick and another seminarian. Not one of the seminarians in that class could translate the sentence. And then Father Gignac said, "Karen, you can do it." And he repeated the Greek, "Enarche ein ho logos," and Karen began to translate. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." It was John chapter 1, verse 1. Father Gignac smiled at his star pupil. Karen had done it again. Karen, the only female in the class, the only non-seminarian in the group, she had once again made the rest of us look unprepared, which in truth is exactly what we were, unprepared. Karen was the mother of 3 small children. She worked full-time and was doing a master's degree in theology at Catholic University to enhance her youth ministry at her local parish. Her schedule was crazy. And yet, when she came to class, she was always prepared. She had done all of the reading and carefully completed all of the homework. And then there were the rest of us, the seminarians. The church was taking care of us day by day, feeding us, giving us time for daily prayer. All we had to do was go to class and do our homework. But somehow, for some reason, we always found a way not to do all of the reading. And we complained constantly about Father Gignac's workload. But Karen, the mother of 3 who was working full-time and volunteering as a youth minister, somehow she found the time to come to class prepared. So, of course, over a period of time, we really started to dislike Karen. No, she was not doing anything wrong, and she wasn't trying to embarrass us. Rather, we just didn't like her because she was doing what all of us were supposed to do. When she showed up, prepared and ready to go, she made the rest of us look like slobs, lazy people. She was doing things right, and her very presence in that class revealed that the rest of us were not doing it right. Sometimes we take offense at people because they're doing something wrong. But at other times, we take offense at people simply because they're doing things right. And their example becomes a challenge to the rest of us. So far in this video series about the saints, this wonderful video series on the saints, we have talked about saints who were beloved when they were alive. Remember that young Nunzio Sulprizio, the 19-year-old from Italy? People loved him when he was alive. And then there was St. Philip Neri, the beloved saint of Rome. People loved to see him as he walked down the sidewalk in Rome smiling. Some saints are popular, loved, and admired while they are walking on this earth. And then there are other saints, like the saint that we're going to learn about today. And those saints have the opposite experience. These are the saints who simply want to do what's right. They're just trying to live the gospel as best they can. And how do the people around them react? They want to get rid of them. Because as long as a saint is in our midst, it's a challenge to those of us who are not living the gospel. Today we meet one of those kinds of saints, and his name is Norbert. The year was 1080, and in the northwest corner of what is now modern Germany, a noble family from a town called Xanten was celebrating the birth of their second son. By all accounts, Norbert was a handsome young man, intelligent and well-mannered. And as a young adult, now how can I put this? It appears that he seemed to really enjoy life. The biographies of Norbert struggle to find the right way to describe Norbert as a young adult. He was a young nobleman with money in his pocket and not much work to do. So his biographers indicate that he enjoyed all the things that rich young men from noble families would have enjoyed in that era. Apparently, that's how Norbert lived, right through his 20s and well into his 30s. He was popular among church and political elites of that era, and for a while it seemed that this is how he would live the rest of his life. After all, he was now almost 35 years old, and back in the 12th century, a man in his mid-30s was considered well into middle age. But God had other plans for Norbert of Xanten. In the year 1115, Norbert and a friend were riding their horses through a forest, and a thunderstorm arose, and a bolt of lightning hit the ground nearby. Norbert's horse was startled, and Norbert got thrown to the ground and was knocked unconscious. And as he was waking up, Norbert had a sense that he was hearing a voice, and that voice was saying to him, "Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it." That's a line from Psalm 34. Norbert's experience in that woods reminds many people of what happened to St. Paul on the road to Damascus. And like Paul, Norbert's conversion was powerful. He went to a local Benedictine abbey for a time of retreat and prayer. The abbot offered very wise advice, and after a period of preparation, eventually Norbert was ordained to the priesthood. And then he went back to that same abbey for more retreat and more wise advice from the abbot. You see, Norbert knew that God had a plan for him, but he just wasn't sure yet of what God's plan was. So he waited and he listened. Eventually, a local bishop asked Norbert to become the leader of a local community of priests that was already there in his diocese. These priests were supposed to gather for prayer several times each day, which they did, sometimes. They were supposed to minister to the local population, which they did, occasionally. They were supposed to help the poor, which they did when it was convenient. They were supposed to be celibate, which they did, sort of. Well, maybe not. When Norbert arrived at this community of priests, he was dressed in very simple clothing. He had renounced all of his earthly wealth, And he was trying to live an authentic vocation of prayer and preaching and chastity and simplicity. After all, this is what Jesus calls us to, and this is what the church requires of its priests. So Norbert simply wanted to do things right. But as I learned at that Greek class at Catholic University, sometimes the person who simply wants to do things the right way becomes a kind of threat to those who don't. And this is what happened to Norbert. He had been sent to make sure that these priests were going to do what was expected of them. And how did they respond? They said, "We're not going to do it your way. We like our life the way it is." One of these priests even approached Norbert and spat in his face. Norbert, being fairly smart, left that stubborn group of priests, and he started wandering from village to village, preaching to the common people in a way that inspired them. Norbert had no money in his pocket. He depended solely on the hospitality of the local people. And frankly, those local people loved and understood his preaching. In other words, Norbert was doing it right. He was doing priesthood right, which of course made some of the other local clergy jealous. They even accused Norbert of preaching without permission. So Norbert took a long walk, a long journey, and obtained permission from the Pope to preach wherever he wanted to preach. Eventually, a local bishop encouraged Norbert to start his own community of priests and brothers, which he did, in an out-of-the-way location called Prémontré, which today is located in France. Norbert told his first companions that they would all lead a simple life of poverty, chastity, obedience, and service to the local people. That community of priests and brothers is officially called the Premonstratensians. Isn't that a mouthful? They're called the Premonstratensians because their community was founded by Norbert in Prémontré. And here we are 900 years later, and that community can be found all over the world. In America, the community is more simply called the Norbertines. They were founded by Saint Norbert. Norbert founded his community, yet he still felt called to travel, to walk from village to village, preaching, ministering to the common people. And Norbert gained a reputation as a peacemaker and reconciler. In that era, political enemies and local noble families regularly engaged in feuds and armed conflicts. And it was often the poor people who were caught in the middle of those armed conflicts, and they paid the highest price. Norbert preached the gospel to these arguing factions, and through the force of his personality and the simplicity of his lifestyle and example, he helped those enemies to become friends. Eventually, Norbert's God-given talents were recognized by higher church authorities, and he was sent to the city of Magdeburg to become the archbishop there. He walked to the city, wearing his poor, dirty clothes, and when he arrived at the archbishop's palace, which was now his home, the doorkeeper wouldn't let him in because he thought that Norbert was just another beggar. Even though he had to live in a palace, Norbert arranged to live a very simple life. He still wore his simple clothes, he ate frugal meals, moved most of the fancy furniture out of his living space. And the local people loved this because their bishop was living the way that they lived. But on the other hand, the priests of Magdeburg were getting worried. And well, they should be worried, because Norbert, soon after he arrived, realized that the local clergy were leading careless and sometimes scandalous lives. They were not ministering generously or effectively to the local people. In other words, they were not doing what they were supposed to do. So Norbert said to them, "From now on, you're going to do the right thing, and so will I." Norbert undertook a major reform of the clergy of his diocese, insisting that they should do what they had promised to do when they were ordained: pray, celebrate the sacraments well, preach in a way that the people could understand, visit the sick, care for the needy. And he demanded that those who were being unfaithful to their vow of celibacy should change their evil ways. I'll bet you can guess how the local clergy reacted to all of this. Well, maybe not. How did they react? They tried to kill him. On at least 3 occasions, Norbert narrowly escaped assassination attempts. That's right. Norbert made the local clergy and some of their political supporters so uncomfortable that they tried to kill their bishop, even when he was celebrating Mass. But God had other plans. Norbert escaped each of those attempts, and by the end of his life, he had succeeded in carrying out his major reforms. He died on June 6th in the year 1134, about 20 years after his ordination, which means he crammed a lot of gospel living into a relatively short amount of time. Some people of his era admired and respected his vision. They admired and respected his example and his invitation to lead a simple life of generous ministry. But Norbert's example was also an uncomfortable challenge to so many people who were not doing the right thing, who were not living the gospel, who were not living the priesthood the way that Jesus had instructed. Saint Norbert, the saint who was disliked simply because he lived the gospel. Come to think of it, isn't this kind of like what happened to Jesus? Wasn't Jesus rejected by many, many people simply because he was doing the will of our Father who art in heaven? So, I have 2 questions for you. First, have you ever found yourself in the position of Karen from my Greek class, or Saint Norbert, or even Jesus? In other words, have you ever been considered the enemy simply because you were doing what's right, or saying what's true, or following God's will? True, every human being makes mistakes at times, but then there are the times when people are upset with us simply because we're doing what's right. It happens all the time in our ordinary life, and it happened to Norbert, and to Jesus, and to Karen. Sometimes we become the target, not because we've done something wrong, but because we're doing things God's way. In those moments when you feel like you are paying the price for doing what's right, well, remember, you are in very good company. The prophets and saints paid this price. Our Savior paid that price. The world is changed for the better when people are willing to pay the price for simply doing what's right and true and Christ-like. But I also want to ask you a second question, and it's this. How do you handle the truth-tellers in your own life? Sometimes we are the ones paying the price for doing what's right, but at other times, if we're honest, we have to admit that we are the ones saying, how can I get that person out of my life? They're driving me crazy with all of their holiness and doing things right and telling the truth. Sometimes saints are not easy to live with. There are parents and children and pastors and spouses who tick us off sometimes, with great regularity even, simply because their good example offers us a stark choice. Do I chase these good people away, or do I let their good example call me to deeper conversion and renewal and greater holiness? Do you have a truth teller in your life right now? Maybe think of it this way. Who is the person you'd love not to deal with right now because they're doing it right and you're not? Who is that person who's forcing you to acknowledge the way, for instance, that jealousy or envy or greed are devouring your life? Who is the truth teller whose example is forcing you to do the uncomfortable work of admitting that your selfishness or your powerlessness or your possessiveness is leading you to sin? Is there someone who is finally uncomfortably making you deal with your warped priorities or your failure to forgive, your unwillingness to be generous and just? If we pay attention to Jesus, he always shakes us up and makes us confront what's true. Sometimes we pay attention and our lives are changed. And often we don't want to deal with him. Many of us simply try to ignore Jesus throughout our week. Maybe we give him a quick hour on the weekend, but in reality, we're keeping him at arm's length. Our lives are always better when we listen to and learn from Jesus Christ, the Logos, the Word made flesh, who dwells among us. Saint Norbert, pray for us.